You build an awesome scenario inside of make.com, but nothing is working. You start getting frustrated at your automation because you have no idea why it stopped working or why it never worked in the first place. Surprisingly enough, that seems to be the reality for many of my subscribers, and because you struggled with that so much, I decided to make a video about it to hopefully help you get a better understanding of how to debug make.com scenarios so that you actually have actionable insights not only on how to identify the issues, but also how to fix them and how to prevent them in the future. So with that out of the way, let's dive right into it. As you can see on my screen, I have a predefined make.com scenario, but before I'm diving into it, I would like to mention that if you would like to get this template completely for free, you can simply download it directly from my resource hub. Simply head over there, the link is down below in the description. You probably know it from my previous videos. So you can literally just follow me along and have that example available for yourself so that you can give it a try and maybe play around with it a little bit if you want to. This will also include all of the files for the Google Sheets, for example, so that you can copy it and you can kind of recreate it. All right, that is just basic information for you to make things easier, but if you just want to stick around and follow me along on the screen to get a better understanding of it, that is totally fine as well. So before I actually dive into how to debug the make.com scenario, I would like to explain a little bit more about how we need to debug it in the first place and how make.com works so that you have an understanding of where to look inside of a scenario. So make.com scenarios are always kind of like one-way execution paths, which means we always start at the left with a trigger and it goes basically to the right until the very last execution path that it can execute depending on conditions whatsoever. So what I mean by that is that we start with the trigger, then this part is executed, then this part is executed, then this part is executed. You get the hang of that, right? Sometimes you have even more complex modules like the router, which we can connect here. And then you can see we have different kind of pathways that we can split up. So let's say here, for example, we have another JSON module to convert something as a JSON. Here we're gonna have another Google Sheets module with add a row, for example. And here we maybe have another current module for getting points whatsoever. So in that case, how would it look like? If make.com is now executing something, it would basically just run through the exact same way here, and then it would follow a certain order. By default, if you create a scenario like I just did right now, it would take the first one, execute that one. It has nothing else to execute. It will basically then go to the next one, execute that one. If there's something else behind that, it will also start executing that. If it executed that, it will go down to the last pathway and then execute that one. So now this is great, but how does it look if I do, for example, this? Will it now execute this one first? No, it doesn't. It's very important because now when we look into the router and we right click it, you see the router or the routes, which is very important because there you see how they are executed, and you can see that this one is still the first one to be executed. Then the second one are the Google Sheet modules, and then the third one is the last path up here. So this is still the last one that's going to be executed. If you want to change the order, you would basically just need to move them around depending on how you need them, right? So in that case, this one would be executed first and this one would be executed last. I'm mentioning that because it is incredibly important if you want to follow pathways and you want to see where exactly it breaks and why it breaks. So if, for example, an error happens here, right? If we know that this pathway is executed first, we know that the error really happens here and these one have not been affected, which means that if you, for example, need this one to be executed before that, you need to make sure that you adjust the routes that this one is executed before that. So in that case, I would probably just move that one maybe even here or here, depending on where you need it, right? But it needs to be then executed before that if there would be an error. This is just the explanation of how the pathways work so that you know what exactly is executed, because that is going to be incredibly important down the line for debugging things when building out more complex scenarios. All right, but with that out of the way, this is stuff we basically don't even need because we actually want to focus on error handling itself. So what I did is I basically just added a set multiple variable field here as a trigger so we can instantly trigger the scenario when testing it. Here I added another module, which is parse JSON. And you will see now that when I run this module, it throws an error. Boom. There we are. First error that we received. Now, one more thing before I'm diving into the actual error itself. You can see three modules here, which are three different parts of errors that I predefined for you, because there are generally, I would say, three types of errors that you encounter when working with make.com. The first one is make.com internal errors, which is the one that we just received right here, which basically defines an error that happens with modules that are provided directly by make.com and that basically don't have an external connection to have any other errors. Then, as you can guess, we have external errors as well, which is Current, because Current, for example, is an external tool. It is a vector database. You don't need to know what it is, but it's important to know that it is hosted on a different server by a different company, and it is an API that we interact with. So in that case, if an error occurs, it probably occurs on the side of that other server, which means it's an external error. So make.com has no power over that. to do certain things that it could maybe do for fixing that error by itself, right? So it relies on the third party giving back a proper response to not throw an error. And with that out of the way, we have the last one, which is a silent error, which is really important and something that is probably the hardest to debug, because a silent error is not really an error, but it is actually just an issue with a thought way of how you laid out the stuff. Because as you know, technology always works in a certain way. You want to format things in a certain way, we want to get information out of it. But if something is wrong in our thought process and we build something in a way that we expect it to work, but this technological part may be needed in a different way, we can get outputs that just don't make sense or they just don't work. But I'm going to get into this step by step for each of those modules so you can get a better understanding of it. All right, the first thing I would like to touch base on is these little bubbles up here, because those are the ones that we work mostly with if we look into debugging things. So these bubbles are basically just representations of the information that we feed into each of those modules and what we get out of it. We can just call it like request and response. Request is what goes in, response is what comes back, right? This is super important to mention because this is how Make.com basically structures out those things. There are some more complexities to it, something like bundles and collections, which basically just mean that those things are executed multiple times, but it is basically the exact same structure like what I'm telling you right now. So if you understand this basic setup, you will also understand collections and bundles because it's literally just loops doing the same things over and over again, and you can see every single execution path. Good. With that out of the way, let's actually look in one that worked, which is this one right here, because you can see it is green and it shows up here 1, which means it was only 1 executions. So if you have bundles or collections, it would be multiple executions. And by clicking into it, we can see operation 1, and then we can see some information in it. So while minimizing it, you can see initialization, which means it has been executed properly by Make.com. Then the operation has been done properly by Make.com. It has been committed and it has been finalized. So this would be a perfect workflow. We can see everything worked out. And when we click on it, you can see input and output. Input would basically be the request or the stuff that we send in. Output would be the response, whatever we get back. So we have just some standard variables, which are empty because we didn't define anything in here. So this is just a placeholder, which means in that case, it just executed it perfectly. It didn't send anything back. There was no error whatsoever. Great. Now, since we know this is the way how it should look, we can already tell by the looks of this module that something didn't work out quite well, right? We can see there's a little danger sign up here as well. And when we click on it, you can see as well some more details, like an arrow on how to do the arrow handling. And you can also see the actual reason for the arrow. Source is not a valid JSON. This is displayed in that way because this is an internal error that happens within Make.com because we didn't provide it information that is right and that it can process in the way it wants to process it. So you can see that this happens as well in the operation. We can say initialization, rollback and finalization has been correct to roll back that information to this specific integration. And you can see that this is the input we wanted to send. And you can also see now that this is actually not a JSON string. So we would like Make.com expects a certain information, in that case a JSON string, and if we're just passing some random text, it breaks and it throws an error. So in that case, it is easy for us to recognize it because Make.com already has a very good error handling, which also defines where the exact error is, which means source is not a valid JSON. So let's now say we're gonna have a valid JSON here, and a valid JSON would be something like this. So we have our curly brackets, we're gonna have, let's say first name, a double point, and then we have Janus. You don't need to remember this, but this would be a valid JSON structure. We don't need to define a predefined data structure format, so this is gonna be a bit more loose, which still works. So if I'm gonna press OK, and I'm gonna run once, you can see, bada, it is green, it works now. We basically were able to parse a JSON from a JSON string to an actual JSON construct. So now you can see as well, we have a 1 up here in the bubble, and by clicking on it, you can now see again that operation is green, commit is correct, finalization is correct, everything worked out. We can also see that we inputted this string and we got the following as an output. So you can see now as well that this is a collection, right? This is basically one execution of that value that we send in, which is exactly what we wanted in that case. It formatted that information. And by the way, if we look in the output bundles, and this is the actual format that we send back, you can see that it is now perfectly formatted as a JSON construct. Great. So this worked out well. We fixed that error by just looking at this little bubble up here, which is always what tells us more about the actual error it is facing and the values we are sending to this integration and the information we get back from it. That is the most important thing to understand because this will affect it for you in so many different ways. Now, since this one works, great, we can move on to the next one because now the next one is throwing another error, which you can see here. which is called current. And the current is, like I mentioned, a vector database. So it's basically just a place where you can store information. And with this one, I'm making an API call. And what this one does is it basically tries to get something from that external server, and it wants to retrieve it. So what it tries to get is a collection called demo collection, just imagining it as something on their server that is called demo collection, and we want to retrieve it with a request, and this request fails. You can see it's not working. So what would I do? I would obviously first click on this little bubble, and you can see here as well that it throws a 404 not found. So it is a little bit more generic because this is not directly controlled by make.com. It literally relies on the information that comes back from the HTTP request. So if that integration or current has proper error handling, we would see some better errors here. But this one already, in my case, because I'm technical, it's already pretty precise. It basically means that the collection, what I'm basically looking for at the external server, doesn't exist. And this is why this whole thing is not continuing. So what could we do to fix that? We would probably need to adjust that value, or we need to add some extra error handling. And error handling can be a very tricky situation depending on how you do it. So I'm just gonna demonstrate it to you in this example, because error handling might be something I'm gonna cover in a separate video, because this is a very own thing for itself. But in that case, for example, if it breaks, we know it doesn't exist, right? But we would like to get that information, or we would like to, we would basically just like to check if that one exists, but we would still like to execute the other parts after. So how would I fix that problem? Because right now it just throws an error and I just know, it doesn't exist, but it doesn't execute all the other parts after, and I would like the other parts to be executed. So what I could do in that case, I could basically add an error handler and I can start executing the other steps using a router. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to unlink those fields, and I'm going to add a router right after this module, and then I'm gonna link the current setup to here, and I'm gonna link the Google Sheet to here. So now, if you remember what I showed you earlier in this video, this path is basically executed in a way that first current is executed, then Google Sheets is executed. We can verify that as well by right-clicking the router and clicking on order routes. And you can see here, this is the first one, this is the second one. Very easy, right? So now, if I'm gonna execute that, you will see that the exact same thing happens. This throws an error, this is not executed because this one breaks. So if I just want to check if it is there, I can basically do some more manipulations after, right? If I wanna, for example, if it's there, I wanna maybe do some other things like get a variable or save something or whatsoever, then it will probably just execute it normally if it would exist. But if it doesn't exist, I don't want the scenario to break. So I can add an error handler, and to add an error handler, all you would do is you would click the integration that throws an error, and we would click on add error handler, and now you can select whatever kind of integration should fire after the error appears. And in my case, since I only want to check if it exists or not, I am going to add the ignore error handler, which does nothing else than ignoring the error. So it's like, you throw an error, I don't care, throw your error. I only want this scenario to continue here with whatever function after when it works. So let's, for example, say set variable, boom, and now I can define whatever I want with this variable name, let's say demo variable. So I can execute whatever I want after, and here within this part, I can now basically define what of that worked and what not, right? So we didn't get the value that we wanted to, and you can also see that there is basically only headers that come through and a status code of 200, which is great in one way, but on the other hand, in the results, we don't get the exact same thing back that we would expect. So we could probably just set up some filters that if it exists, then do this. If it doesn't exist and it throws an error, we ignore it. And look now, I'm gonna format that quickly. And if I'm gonna run this whole thing once, you can see now, boom, it threw an error and went into the ignore, it ignored it, and it continued the execution. So this way, I basically bypass this whole issue of what I've seen with this current module, right? Now, before heading into the Google Sheets, I would like to give you another information, because at the end of this video, I'm going to show you another module, which is very important, and you've seen it in many of my scenarios. It's called the HTTP integration with the send request module or action. So this is a whole nother thing I'd like to cover specifically, because it is used so often that it probably makes sense to have a specific part of the video dedicated only to this. This is just to mention. Now we're gonna dive into the silent issue, which is another big one you might receive during working with make.com. So as you can see here, this module has been executed. I basically have this one connected to a very simple Google Sheets that is right here. It is just called YouTube test sheet, and it now has a value right within here. So now it executed it perfectly, right? But let's, for example, say, oh hey, we're getting like some weird numbers here. We expected a date, right? So we have some kind of error because this is not the outcome we expected, because we expected a date and a formatted date. So what can we do? We can, for example, look into what we actually send along. So you can see these are the values we send as an input. We can see in the values that, aha, this is the actual same value we have over here, right? So we basically already inputted that, which means whatever we added into this module or whatever came into this integration, this already was wrong, which means the error probably didn't happen by the integration itself, but it happened by whatever we put into it. So if we are opening this one now, you can see that we're sending through a timestamp, which is that exact value that we just seen here. Because you can see as well, it defines it for value A, so row A. I'm going to look into it and I'm going to look into value. You can see for A, this is the value that comes through. Again, like I mentioned, because we're in the input and the output is a different one. Output just mentioned in that case, okay, it did everything well. It sends back some extra information, but the input already was wrong because inside the values, we have a number that is not what we expect. So in that case, what I would do is I would just probably head into here and I would actually just replace the timestamp by something else that represents more what I would like. So in my case, let's for example say something like format date. Then I'm gonna paste this variable in here. And let's say I would like to have the month and the year that I would like to add there. Boom, perfect. So now I can execute the scenario again. And you can see this one was executed. Now if I head back into my sheet, you can see it says June 2024. Perfect. So now we basically have the formatted date. But this is exactly what I like to mention. Even though it might have run here, we got some output right within our Google Sheet that was not what we have expected. So in that case, we not really have an error, but it is more like a misrepresentation of the things we expected this whole scenario to do. But it actually did something else because we didn't understand something fully, or our thought process was just not complete and optimized to whatever we wanted as an outcome. So in that case, to debug those silent errors, you would always need to go in, look into the input bundle and check what you actually sent through. Because if this one would be wrong already, you know that it either has to do with the variables you have been adding here or with any variables that you manipulated before and that you are then adding here. And what I mean by that is, let's for example say we have the multiple variables defined. So let's say we're gonna have, let's say we call it time string, and we literally just add exactly what we had right within here. So let's say we have format date. I'm gonna add again the now, and I'm gonna say in the year. So basically what we had before. And now I'm gonna add this part right within here, right? Because we can select it dynamically. And I'm gonna execute it now. You will see that this one will be the exact same because it's the same value. But now if we look into here, we can see that the value was actually passed properly along, which means whatever we have in here was sent correctly. But now imagine this one would have been wrong. Let's say here there would be a number again instead of that. We can look into the actual module. We would see, aha, A is a time string. As you can see on the left, it's now pumping. It's like pulsing or pulsating. So we know the value is coming from there. So if we click into here, we know, aha, okay, the error must have happened right within this module or this integration. So this is just a way of thought. Like, it's just my thought process on how you can figure out things, which in my opinion makes it fairly easy to understand what happens inside of your scenario and how you can fix it and address it in the first place. Great. Now there is another thing that we can debug, which is with the HTTP module, because it's a very modular one. And I want to make sure you understand exactly what that means. So let's just unlink that part, and I'm just going to add another module here, down here with the HTTP integration. You can see that here. Once clicking on it, I'm going to add the make a request module, and you can now see that you can basically fill out some information. So I'm able to basically just add some URL. And let's, for example, assume now I'm adding a URL that doesn't really exist, right? And we have a get value. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to run that. You will now see that it basically tries to call it, but it will never get a response because this URL just simply doesn't exist. This domain doesn't exist. There will never ever be a response. So at some point it will just run in a timeout, as you can see now, HTTP, clicking on it, and you see service not reachable, which means, again, some error happens. Now, in that case, because we're using the HTTP module, things are more generic, and it makes it a bit harder of debugging things. What I often like to do is, I like to just open the module, and in the input section, or in the output section, right now we don't have that, but in the output section, I like to see what actually came back from that URL, because that gives me an understanding of, if I get an answer back, I know it's probably reachable. Like right here, we don't get an answer back, so it doesn't really exist. So how I would go about testing those kind of things is I would probably just try to ping that website locally, even though that's not even the point, but I can see if anything else inside of this HTTP module that I set up is wrong. So let's say you have some kind of data defined, right? Let's say we have like a JSON construct defined or something. So we're just gonna add a quick JSON here, call it first name, like what I always do. We call it Janis. Perfect. So now we have, for example, a JSON defined. So how can we make sure that nothing what we define is actually the issue, but the domain is actually the issue? So there's another nice tool that I definitely recommend you checking out and knowing, which is called webhook.site, which looks like this. So you simply head over to webhook.site and you will see a page like this. And you can already see here it says waiting for first request. So what this basically is, it's like a debugging tool that allows us to understand what happens inside of requests or inside of things we're sending along with URLs. I have a complete video on my channel about requests. I definitely suggest you checking that out. It's worth it. So just to give you an understanding, what I would do is I would copy this unique URL, which can basically accept things. And I'm just going to show you what that means by accepting things. So if I open this URL directly in my browser, you will see that it just sends back some information, some standard basic information. But you can now see inside of this request that it actually came in, so we can track it out. We can see we have no query strings defined, and you can see some headers, of things that my stuff basically runs on whatsoever. So we've basically tested it. We have a get request, because when you call something in your browser, you always want to get information. You never want to send something. This is like a very basic explanation. Like I mentioned, I have a video about that. You can definitely check it out to get a better understanding of what requests are. But for now, let's just accept the fact that this helps you to debug those requests. So what I would do is I would basically just copy the URL we just called here. We're gonna head into our make.com scenario, and now I'm just replacing this URL with the URL that I just added, or that I copied from webhook.site, and I'm gonna try this whole thing again. So now you can see it sends HTTP correct, and you can see that the request basically goes through, because webhook.site kind of accepts any request, and it displays that information visually. And now you can see as well, we get back a status code 200, which means it is correct. So everything in the 200 range usually means the request was received by the server, and it did something right. Or it basically returned you the information, it gave you whatever you needed for, or it accepted you sending some information. That's like a very basic explanation of it. So if you see something like 200 plus until 299, you know that things are probably on the right track, and they are either worked out already or they're close to it. Then you also have the data, which is the exact same thing we saw in the browser. You can see this URL has no default content configured. And now if we're heading over to webhook.site, you can see we have a get request, and we actually have this information inside of the body of that request. So now there's one thing I need to mention. Usually what I did here is not a standard of webhooks. We never want to see a get request and sending information along in the body. This is very bad practice. How we would like to see it is that when we make a request, we want to send post information if you want to send something along. So this is very important to mention, because if those content types mismatch, they are often interpreted wrongly. So now we're sending it along as a post, and you can see first name Janis is a JSON, and JSON is also defined as a content type here, which is really important to mention, because even if the content type does not match, like let's say this is application, instead of application JSON, we have some text format, then this would not be interpreted correctly. So all of that is reason for error, and you can actually debug that by just checking right within here what comes back as an error. And this is what I mentioned, like, in a lot of my automations that I provide to you for free on my YouTube channel, you will see those kind of HTTP modules, and when you run them and you see an error, for example, or it doesn't do something the way you want it, you always can click on this little bubble up here that comes when you test it manually by clicking on run once. And down here in the bundle section, you always have a data key, and this data key always contains, or should always contain, some information about what happened behind the scenes during that request. So this helps you a lot to understand what went wrong, where there was maybe an issue, so that you can better debug those kind of things inside of your make.com scenarios. Obviously, when you have this information, another thing you can do is you can literally just use that info, whatever came back through, and you can just ask ChatGPT about that response, what is the problem? So how I would do that, I would probably just go up here on this little button, I go to download output bundles, and you will get a JSON like this, and then you would just take this and you would ask ChatGPT something like, this is an output bundle of make.com, please tell me where the error is. And that's it. Make.com probably can give you some more guidance on what is wrong based on that request, because it usually gives you some more information directly inside of the setup where the problem is. Great. With that out of the way, we now are at the end of this video. I hopefully managed to give you an understanding of how you can debug make.com scenarios, how you can actually figure out where an error is, and how you can address this error. We've also briefly touched the error handling right here, which is where I'm gonna make another separate video about, so that you can get an understanding of how we do error handling internally and how it makes sense to set up your make.com scenarios so that they barely fail if there's any failure at all. Because there are still things like with Google Feeds that sometimes might fail if the service is down, if there's an error, and you don't want to lose the data. So what I showed you now is for debugging errors. What I'm going to show you in the future is how to handle errors. And that's all I'm going to add for now. I'm going to send this one over to you directly through my resource hub, so you will have access to the setup. You can simply download it, use it for yourself, check it, try it. And if there are any further questions, you're most welcome to drop them below in the comments. And that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.